Okay, so we've been springing our way across the applications here. So we've already Spring enabled our web services so we can define services with Spring Beans. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put Spring into our secure token service and then use Spring LDAP Authenticator to authenticate the user that's trying to call in, or to authenticate the client that's trying to call into the STS and get a token. Right now, if you remember in our previous video, we had it hard-coded to be these users. Well, we're going to flip it over now to use a Spring LDAP call. And we have a VM running. We have Apache DS running on that VM. And so let's see, here we have JExplorer. And here's the user. I'm logged in as that user right now. So if I was to go here, you'd see here I'm logged in as the user. So we'll switch it over to the Apache DS admin. Okay, so here's the user. And here's the UID. This is the UID that we're going to use to authenticate. I already set his password to WS Client 1. Okay, so now how do we do that? Well, we go to WebXML. Well, of course, the first thing we had to do is add Spring to our libraries. Now, unlike what we did with the web services, we didn't need that extra JAX-WS library so we could define our WS tags. But Spring LDAP does seem to have a dependency on Apache Commons Lang, or Apache Commons Lang, right? Because it's using string utils. So it just so happens I have a few Apache Commons libraries here, and one of them is Lang. So okay, so we added our Spring libraries. I also have some Spring LDAP libraries, and the Apache Commons. So if we go, I think we can go here and we can take a look. Okay, so this is the standard Spring that comes with NetBeans. I'm running 691. Okay, and here are the two LDAP Spring libraries I'm using, LDAP Core 131 and Core Tiger 131 release jars. And then you see here we have Apache Commons. What we're looking for here is Commons Lang, because LDAP uses string utils. So we needed that. Okay, so now we got our library straightened out. Let's take a look at WebXML. We define the context for our application context. We define a listener for Spring to load our context up. Okay, so here's our context. Pretty normal stuff. If you actually created a NetBeans Spring app, you would get this by default. So we have, now what we had to do is we had to add a property configurer, because we want them to load our LDAP properties, because that's going to define our connection information to our LDAP server, how we're going to authenticate to the server so we can authenticate a user. Okay, now here we're setting up our LDAP context source. So here you see our URL, the base DN we're using, the user DN. This is the admin user that we're going to log into the server with in order to do the authentication. And we're defining pooled connections. And here's our LDAP template. We're passing it the context source. And then here's our custom authenticator. And we're passing it the LDAP template. So if we go look now at our LDAP properties, you see here's the URL to our LDAP server. Now, in real life, you'd want to use LDAP-S and change this to the SSL port. Here's our base DN, the 7 Cs. If we look back to JExplorer, you'll see that's our base here. This is where all our users are. And this is where our WS client lives. Okay, so now we go back, and here's the UID of our system admin user. And here's the password for this system admin user, and our pooled option is turned on. Okay, now we go back here and we see we have an application context provider. Now what happens is when Spring comes up and reads this, he's going to notice that this guy is implementing an application context aware. So he's going to call the setter to set our context. And the reason why we're doing that is because we're going to need to call the getter in order to get our bean. And in this case, our bean is going to be our STS authenticator. Okay, so now what happens is when the client tries to log in to our STS, the STS is going to call our plain text password validator. Our validator is going to call the static method on our provider here and get the context, which Spring has wired up for us already. Then once we get that context, we're going to use it to get our STS authenticator bean, and then we're going to call the authenticate WS user on that bean, passing it the user and the password. Now, our authenticator is very simple. You see, the constructor just takes that LDAP template that we defined here in our context, right? So, and then our authenticate WS user method takes the user ID password. We're setting up an LDAP query, which basically says search all object class persons and search a user ID looking for this person's UID in every object class person until you find a match. And we're going to pass that filter into the built-in authenticate method that's built into the template. And we're going to authenticate that user and pass it in the password. So it's the user that's found by running this query, and here's that user's password. And this is basically saying start at the base. So this would be like putting an empty string to start the query from this filter. Okay, so now if we authenticate, we'll return true and we're good to go. Otherwise we return false. Okay, so once we have everything wired up, we can redeploy our STS, and then in our client, when we go look at our web services and our properties for our STS service, you see here we have a user ID and password. So we have it set to WS Client 1, because that's the user that we have in our LDAP server in Apache DS running on our VM. Okay, so now just for fun, let's run this guy and see if we can authenticate. Okay, we're taking off. Okay, so I guess we were able to authenticate. So if we go look at our log here, okay, as I mentioned in one of the previous videos, the reason why we're getting this is because the MEX doesn't have a WSDL. And so Tomcat's getting a little bugged about it, but it doesn't, he just ignores it. It's just probably turned this logging off somehow. But here's our plain text password validator. Here's the user ID we passed in, and then we called our get user by name method in our web service. So that worked out. Okay, so now just to prove that it will fail if we don't authenticate, let's change our user ID to junk user. Okay, now rerun the client. And kablooey, our authentication failed, and that's exactly what we were looking for. So we'll go back into our client attributes, and we'll set it back to WS client, and then this time we'll blank out the password and see what happens. Because sometimes LDAP servers will let you log in with a blank password. It's an anonymous authentication. So let's see what happens. And kablooey, we couldn't log in, which is excellent. So now let's go and, I don't know why I keep doing that. Let's go back, edit, and we'll put the right password back in, WS CLIENT1. And we'll rerun the authentication, and this time we should be working again. Okay, excellent. And here we got our return value from the web service like we did in our previous videos. So there you have it. So we took our STS, we implemented Spring LDAP authentication. So now the plain text authenticator for the secure token service is now calling in to LDAP to authenticate the client. We modified the client so that it passes in the proper credentials to authenticate, and then once it authenticates, it gets a token, and then it can pass that token and run the web service, and then the web service can validate the token again with the STS, and everybody's happy. See y'all.